Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to speak to you about something that matters enormously to me, and I hope to many of us. So what I've tried to do with this talk is to keep it at a relatively high level, because I wanted to make sure that we covered as much ground as possible. So the way the talk is structured, I'm going to talk about the impact of vaccines, what the challenges are in India, what is the future of vaccines, and how we can develop the more challenging vaccines, and how we respond to outbreaks and global response, particularly what is India doing in this area. So moving first to the impact of vaccines, this is a picture that was unfortunately still familiar when I was a child. I remember people within the communities that I lived in actually having smallpox. And all of us who were of a relatively better socioeconomic status had received smallpox vaccines. However, having smallpox vaccines was a tool that had been available to us for a very long time. Even in the 1700s, 400,000 people used to die every year of smallpox, and towards the end of that century, in 1796, we had Edward Jenner's experiments. They had also been done by Benjamin Jesty before, that led to the development of a vaccine. And this was a unique idea for a vaccine which has been used subsequently, which is you take an animal agent and you use that to try and prevent a human disease. And there have been several examples of that approach to the development of vaccines. So from 1796, when the vaccine was developed, by 1800, the vaccines were being given across Europe and North America, and by 1900, smallpox had been eliminated across the industrialized world. However, it took a much longer time for the vaccines to come into the more impoverished world, and it was only when the WHO decided to lead an eradication effort and develop a strategy called ring immunization that it became possible to control outbreaks of smallpox and made sure that the vaccine reached as many people as possible. This resulted in the disease being eliminated in 1979, and we could come up with not needing to immunize children anymore. Now that happened with smallpox. We are trying to do the same with polio today, but I'd like to show you how in different situations vaccines can affect disease. So if you look here at measles, measles is an endemic disease. You have measles, it has a very high rate of transmission. So if you don't get good coverage with the vaccine, you can actually have continuing transmission of measles. Now shown here is what happened to measles in the US. As soon as the vaccine is introduced, you can see cases coming down. We have now come to a situation where in the West, people don't believe they need measles vaccine anymore because they think that the vaccine might be dangerous. You're taking an antigen and putting it into people where you haven't seen a case of measles in a while. And the folly of that approach is being recognized now because we have measles outbreaks in the US. You have under-immunized communities, so that if one case of measles gets in, it starts to spread. So if you go to Disneyland, you'd better make sure that your children have been immunized, because that's been the starting point for at least 2 outbreaks in both Florida and in California. Now, what happens with epidemic disease? What can you do with epidemic disease and vaccines? And I give you the example of meningococcal disease in New Zealand. If you can see what's happening in the graph there, meningococcus wasn't common in New Zealand, the number of cases really started to go up in about 20, 30 years ago. New Zealand developed a new meningococcal vaccine, started to use it, and you can see what happened to the cases. As soon as vaccination was introduced, the number of cases crashed. A similar situation has been seen with the outbreaks of meningitis A, meningococcus A, which has been causing outbreaks in sub-Saharan Africa. A vaccine developed in India by the Serum Institute was introduced in 2009 in sub-Saharan Africa. In 3 years, we wiped out disease. So much so that people now worry about Men-C and Men-W instead of Men-A, because between campaigns of immunization and routine immunization, we've managed to get rid of meningitis in what was known as the meningitis belt in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have a lot of vaccines that are available for bacteria, and shown in red are the ones that we have in our national immunization program. Shown in green are the vaccines that are available in the country which are not being used nationally currently. And shown in black are those where vaccines are available but are not available in India. If you look at viral diseases, again, we have a lot of vaccines that are in the national program and several that are available but are not being used nationally, and still others where there are vaccines but we don't currently have them in India. Now, what can vaccination do? I showed you 2 examples of what vaccines do in epidemic disease. I showed you an example of endemic disease. But vaccination doesn't just prevent disease, it actually saves lives. And to those who have seen vaccine preventable diseases in communities, we understand this. But the benefit of vaccines goes beyond just preventing disease and improving health. Now, if you look at how you get the benefit of vaccines, there are many ways of looking at it. And what people had was initially a narrow view which said you don't have disease, you survive, and that's the benefit that vaccines offer. We are now beginning to understand that that's not the only thing that vaccines do. They have a much broader impact on society and how society views itself. So if you look at health, there is a very close relationship between health and income. If you're not sick, you can study, you can go to work, you derive economic benefit from being more highly educated and having a better job. But similarly, in countries that have a higher income, they can then provide all those resources cycling back into the population, and that results in an improvement in health. It's been estimated that if you get a 10-year gain in life expectancy in a country, that translates to 1 additional percentage point of annual growth of income per capita. Now, just to explain that in a little more detail, I will go through every step and every box in this. I won't. Okay, so if you look at this, if you look at what immunization can do and how you measure the value of immunization, there are actually studies now where people have done experiments, where people have taken observations, as well as modeled the benefits that vaccines can have. So this is just to illustrate how vaccines can actually affect a society. What it results in is better child survival, in reduced caregiver absenteeism, so more people going to work, improved cognition and education, lower healthcare expenditure, and increased consumption. So society as a whole benefits when you prevent disease using vaccines. So moving on from the impact of vaccines to the challenges that we have in India, I think people bemoan how badly we do in immunization because they don't understand the scale of the problem. Immunization in WHO estimates that it prevents about 2 to 3 million deaths globally every year. However, if we had full immunization, we could prevent another 1.5 million deaths. About 19 million infants don't get the vaccines that they could be getting, either complete immunization or incomplete immunization. We are not reaching every child with every vaccine, and if we did that, we could even more substantially impact health. In India, unfortunately, people keep saying that, if we solved India, we could solve a lot of the world's problems. That's because India has the most unimmunized and the most incompletely immunized children in the world. If you look at India's contribution, that is the green triangle at the base, India contributes 21% of global child mortality, which is a greater proportion than our population. Of the child mortality in India, there is a fair amount of it that is potentially preventable by vaccination. Where can vaccines be helpful? We have tetanus, measles, pneumococcus, Hib, pertussis, rotavirus, and cholera vaccines, where these particular diarrhea and pneumonia are big causes of death, and we could be preventing disease due to these with vaccines. Now, what have vaccines done in India so far? We got rid of smallpox. We got rid of polio in 2011. Last year, we had maternal and neonatal tetanus elimination, which means that we have less than 1 case per 1,000 live births. We've now introduced a second dose of measles, which is currently in a campaign. I believe in Karnataka it was late last year and early this year and didn't do as well as we had hoped, because there are anti-vaccine messages that are spreading in communities. But when measles second dose is introduced, measles does decrease. With diphtheria, we had gotten to less than 3,000 cases per year. Last year, unfortunately, we had outbreaks of diphtheria in Kerala and in UP in under-immunized communities. So the danger of reducing coverage still persists, and pertussis, we've managed to reduce disease by over 80% in 20 years. Now, the routine immunization program in India is the largest program in the world. We have the largest birth cohort. We have about 26 million children who need to be reached every year with all of our basic vaccines. We also have approximately 30 million pregnant women who need to receive their tetanus immunization. So in order to do that, we have 9 million routine immunization sessions every year. So just imagine the scale of the government infrastructure that is required to deliver this. Now, these sessions are served through 27,000 cold chain stores. Vaccines need to be maintained at a certain temperature, so therefore you need to be able to transport vaccine and have a supply chain that ensures that vaccines are maintained as required. Now, with all this effort, what we managed to achieve is 61% full immunization coverage. And for DPT-3, which is the third dose of the routine immunization, we get up to 72%. Every time we have a national immunization day, the polio programs, 2 drops for your child, done on 2 Sundays, 1 month apart, that reaches 172 million children every year. The numbers, the sheer scale of what we are trying to do is very, very difficult to comprehend. and the logistics that lie behind that require that we all work together on this. So what are the challenges? The scale is clearly one. The second is that we haven't actually managed to move beyond childhood and maternal immunization. We know that we have vaccines that can prevent diseases in adults. Flu, for example, we don't use it, and there are several reasons for that. The other is because health is a concurrent subject, policy gets decided at the center and is delivered by the states. So there is a huge heterogeneity in performance. The southern states generally do well. There's a belt in the north that doesn't do so well, and that results in unreached children. The other is our approaches are very different. You should be having routine immunization. What we wind up with is campaigns, or a new program that is called Mission Indradhanush, which is a periodic intensification of routine immunization. You categorize all the districts in the country, and in each state you take up the quarter of districts that are the worst performing and try to make them perform better. So lots of challenges. However, we are doing some good things. We managed to introduce pentavalent vaccine against a lot of resistance, particularly from anti-vaccine lobbyists, and that vaccine is now being given countrywide. We have Japanese encephalitis, where we have a partial expansion and adult immunization. So it's in 210 districts across the country. Rotavirus is now being given in 8 states, and the goal is for a planned expansion across the country. We have pneumococcal and human papillomavirus vaccines that were introduced this year. So this is where we are in India, and just to do a short segue into the story of the work that we've done on the Indian rotavirus vaccine, I'd like to tell you about a little bit about rotavirus. It's a double-stranded RNA virus, which is the commonest cause of dehydrating gastroenteritis in the young of multiple species. Humans are only one of them. Group A rotaviruses cause disease in humans, but there are lots of other rotaviruses that cause severe disease in animal species as well. So this virus causes a lot of diarrhea, but it also causes asymptomatic infections in neonates. And Dr. Bhan, working at the All India Institute in Delhi, was able to identify a neonatal strain in the 1980s, found that it asymptomatically infected children, but also noted that when these children were discharged from the hospital, they developed less severe rotavirus gastroenteritis than children who had been uninfected while they were in the nursery. So this was the basis for development of a vaccine, and initially this development was supported by the Indo-US Vaccine Action Program, and a lot of the initial studies wound up being done in the US, and in the late 1990s it was licensed to Bharat Biotech in Hyderabad. Bharat Biotech took forward the development of this vaccine, and this vaccine finally was tested in 3 areas and had a 55% efficacy. This is the vaccine that is now in the national program, and earlier this year we had a vaccine that was developed by Serum Institute of India, and that vaccine is going to come into some of the states that we are doing. The 8 states that have introduced vaccine are currently using Rotavac. Now, what is the potential burden that can be alleviated by a vaccine that has 55% efficacy? When people look at rotavirus vaccines, they always say, oh, in the West it has 90% efficacy. You're using an inferior product in India because it has only 55% efficacy. But all vaccines, even the vaccines that are 90% efficacious in the West, are still only somewhere between 50 and 60% efficacious in Asia and Africa. So even if you have 50% efficacy, what is the disease burden that you can alleviate? And I'd just like you to look at, these are Indian figures. We get 3.2 million outpatient visits because of rotavirus gastroenteritis. We have 800,000 hospitalizations every year because of rotavirus gastroenteritis and about 78,000 deaths. That means 1 in about 350 children born in India will die of a rotavirus gastroenteritis. So even with 50% efficacy of a vaccine, we have the potential to prevent a lot of disease, a lot of hospitalizations, and a lot of deaths. Now that is the reason why India decided to introduce the vaccine. It was introduced first in Himachal Pradesh and subsequently in 4 states, initially in 1 district of Himachal and then across the entire state in Orissa, Andhra and Haryana. That was 9% of the birth cohort. With the addition of 4 more states, we've gone up to another 20% of the birth cohort, and we hope later this year UP will introduce the vaccine, and that's 22% of the Indian birth cohort. So ultimately, by the end of the year, we hope that half of Indian children will be receiving the vaccine, and this has the potential to prevent about 30 to 40,000 deaths every year at current vaccine coverage rates. So to summarize, we developed a vaccine that was made in India, by India, for India. It's now being used in the national program. It can save 30,000 lives per year, but this is not the end of our work. We are actually now carrying out studies monitoring the impact and the safety of this vaccine, because the vaccine is associated with a rare safety event. We are also looking at what are strategies to improve the performance of the vaccine, which currently is at 50%. Even if we pushed it up to 70%, that would result in a lot less disease and more lives saved. So there's lots of work still to do. Now, what about the future of vaccines? People say that all the easy vaccines have been done. There aren't going to be very many more vaccines in the future because it's so difficult and expensive to make them. So there are many new strategies that are being established for making vaccines, and listed here are just some examples of the strategies that are being used both for infectious diseases as well as for non-communicable diseases. Now, the problem with vaccines and the development of vaccines really comes from the fact that if you look at the different stages of vaccine development, starting with identification of a target antigen, going through preclinical proof of concept, phase 2, and then to registration, this is how the probability of success and costs relate to each other. So it's very cheap to do things in the initial stages, but as soon as you get into clinical testing, and particularly for phase 3 testing, the vaccine development becomes very expensive. So one of the things we are thinking about is, can you change things so that you test a lot more vaccines and make sure that they fail early? If they fail early, you actually reduce the costs, but increase the probability of success for those that do go forward. And there are discussions on what are the various strategies to develop this. And we've been thinking about how do you change vaccine research to be able to do this. There are a number of reasons why we have so many candidates being evaluated and going to late stages. Some of these are the fact that we really don't have good animal models. We also find it difficult to develop testable hypotheses. You don't have correlates of protection for many vaccines because you don't understand enough about the disease in humans. And there are very poor strategies to decide what should and should not go forward. So one approach that we have been thinking about is exploratory clinical studies. The current paradigm actually is that you move from mouse studies to non-human primates and get into humans. But is it possible for us to do deep exploration of human disease and then decide based on that how you should select a vaccine candidate, test it early, and then go back to develop animal models and come back again to humans? Now this is called now an exploratory clinical study, and these are small studies that can be used to either generate or test a hypothesis early in humans in order to provide information that can accelerate discovery or translation. So the scope of these studies are usually these are small studies, very few individuals, and these include controlled human infection models, and I'll speak about this a little bit. And the idea is really to generate and to test hypotheses. So how do you go with a controlled human infection model? And this is something that we have begun to discuss now with ICMR. A controlled human infection model is where humans are your guinea pigs. You actually induce disease in humans and evaluate what happens in humans before you think about taking the disease into animals. Now, these have actually been in use for more than 70 years. Initially, when people started off, this was done in many parts of the world, and at that time, a lot of experimental infections were induced in people who had no say in the matter. So prisoners were very popular. Children who were in orphanages were very popular. Particularly children who were in care homes because they had mental deficits were very popular. And that, of course, there was an outcry about the lack of ethics of these studies, and they stopped being done. We are coming back to those studies now with the idea that if you can appropriately, ethically design studies in humans, you might actually have volunteers who would be willing to participate in such trials. So I'll give you an example of Oxford. Undergraduates in Oxford are participating in typhoid challenge studies. They basically drink live typhoid bacilli, and they are monitored within the Oxford Clinical Research Unit. So I ask you this, why is typhoid being done in Oxford? Is it likely to be a problem for them? Or should we be doing these kinds of studies here in India? So there have been about 60 different challenge strains that have been developed and used. Clearly, when you do these studies, safety of participants is paramount. So selecting the right challenge strain is very important. It should not produce severe disease. You should have fail-safe mechanisms for knowing when to stop testing or to abort infections. So for typhoid, for example, you get a fever, you'll get an antibiotic to which that particular challenge strain is sensitive. So for chimps, there have been studies that have used volunteers for influenza and for typhoid. Between 1,000 and 2,000 human volunteers have participated. In others, it has been varying numbers. But there are diseases for which challenge models may be a way forward for us to develop vaccines. Finally, coming to outbreaks and global responses, we all recognize what happened with SARS and with Ebola, where the response came late. So people have been thinking about what is it that we can do to make sure that we do things early with vaccines. So I'll give you an example of Ebola, and this is shown here in this graph is the cases of Ebola. And the shaded area is where the vaccines could have been tested. But if you look at where the vaccine started to be introduced, the vaccine started to be introduced in March, where the cases had pretty much gone away. So only one of the approximately 20 to 30 vaccine trials that took place at various stages actually dealt with cases of Ebola. And therefore, even though we had multiple vaccine designs, we have wound up with only one vaccine that could come to an efficacy endpoint. So if we had been able to move that discussion 6 months forward, we could potentially have wound up testing more than one vaccine candidate and had greater likelihood of success in this area. So these were the clinical trials that were done in various places. There have been about 8 more trials after that in various parts of the world. And as I said, despite the number of clinical trials, we wound up with only one trial accruing enough cases for us to be able to say this vaccine works. This was the trial that was done in Guinea. This was a ring vaccination strategy where if you had contacts of cases of Ebola, you either got the vaccine immediately or you got the vaccine after 21 days. If you got the vaccine immediately, 0 contacts developed disease. If you got it after 21 days, 22 contacts developed disease, showing that this vaccine had 100% efficacy in the prevention of Ebola. So what people have been thinking about for the last 2 years is just in case and just in time. How can you be prepared by having vaccine candidates available when an outbreak happens? And can you have a rapid response speed so that you can make vaccines quickly? And in order to do that, you need to have multiple candidates. We have a lot for Ebola, but for other diseases that cause outbreaks or might potentially cause outbreaks, we really don't have a lot of candidates available. So a grouping has been put together called CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which is intended to stimulate, finance, and coordinate vaccine development against priority threats, and particularly where the big companies are not going to be willing to solve problems of the developing world, which is where outbreaks occur. Now, CEPI works in partnership with the WHO to define the candidates, and it is important for us to recognize that CEPI's intention is to build technical platforms and capacities in developed and in developing countries that can be deployed against new and unknown pathogens. This is really intended to be a gap-filling mechanism because the current situation is if you have a pandemic, influenza for example, it will affect the whole world. So the big companies are interested in making a new flu vaccine. But if you have a Nipah outbreak, which happens only in Malaysia, Bangladesh, and West Bengal, there's not going to be an interest in a big company developing that vaccine. So CEPI is intended to be that gap-filling role where the candidates are not of interest to big companies, and India is engaged with CEPI. So this is a matter of pride that the Department of Biotechnology decided early on that it wanted to be a funding partner for CEPI, and this is a process that we are taking forward along with the government of Norway, the Wellcome Trust, and the Gates Foundation. So there are multiple ministries involved with that, as well as industry stakeholders, and at the NCR Biotech Cluster, where I am now based, we are preparing for participation in this endeavor. So it will be the first time that India has decided to lead from the front in a global effort, and certain things are going to be tremendously important for us. The reason that I brought up CHIMS as well as CEPI is because we need ethical and regulatory frameworks so that we can plan appropriately for rapid response and for the testing of interventions. Without that platform, there is no way we can take this forward. So to summarize, we are hoping that India will be a leader in vaccines. It's important to remember that India is already a leader in vaccines. India makes vaccines for the world, but it doesn't make new vaccines. We are hoping that through this effort, in the next few years, we will be able to start to make new vaccines that will impact not just public health in India, but public health globally. So it's an opportunity for us to lead in an area that's important for health security. So to summarize, vaccines are a best buy for public health. India has implementation challenges and development challenges. Taking on new vaccine development is a huge opportunity for the advancement of science, but also for our industry and for public health. Experimental medicine and platform technologies are possible. There are hurdles, of course, but this is the right time for us to get to work. So thank you, and I'd like to leave you with the fact that 2/3 of the world's children already receive a vaccine that's made in India, and I hope we can expand our range and scope.
Why not pyramid the vaccination? By that I mean only 50% of the cases it is working. Why not for the cases where it is not working, why not give the US vaccine? Why it is being prevented?
It's not being prevented. The vaccines are available, but this is population characteristics that determine the performance of the vaccine rather than the characteristics of the vaccine itself. Okay. So we need to change things. People think that this is environmental dysfunction of the gut that determines whether you respond or don't respond to an oral vaccine.
But it has been tried.
It has been tried. The same vaccine that is 90% in the US is 40% in Bangladesh.
Okay. No, but revaccinating those people with another vaccine, I mean.
So boosting doses, yes, boosting doses of vaccine has been tried, and it really depends on the individual whether they respond or not. Increasing the number of doses doesn't work. So I've done these studies, it doesn't work.
And I also like to make a comment. In the case of rotavirus, lot of pioneering work was carried out with animals. And Durga Rao of this institute made a pioneering contributions which people forget, never mention.
Actually, not just Dr. Durga Rao, but his wife as well.
Yes, I know.
So
Yes, sir. Wonderful talk. But you mentioned that there are anti-vaccine lobbies. Why should there be anti-vaccine lobbies when it is such a wonderful gift?
I'd like to discuss that with you, but anti-vaccine lobbyists have a multi-stage process for denying the utility of vaccines. Starting with there is no disease. If there is no disease, the vaccine doesn't work, it's too expensive, it's dangerous, etc., etc. Sure.
This CHIM or CHIM or KIM, whatever you call it,
Yes.
is it ongoing or is it a future plan? Is malaria Oxford students, are they going through this?
Yes.
It's very surprising.
Yes.
My question is, if it is going through, is there any single case where the fatality occurred and how the state occurred?
No. So this is why choosing the challenge strain is so important. You have to take volunteers who are healthy and keep them in an environment where they can be looked after. So none of the diseases do you ever go in where you think there is going to be any chance of mortality. So for example, for malaria, you will always take a strain that can respond to treatment. For typhoid, you take a strain that responds to treatment. Dengue challenge is being done in the University of Vermont, but there they are using a strain that does not produce severe disease. It only produces a mild fever, so it's more an infection model than a disease model.
The ethical clearance will be a disaster because
Absolutely. So
Guatemalan prison, you know the whole, how many things have been written about.
I agree. And currently in India, we are at a stage where we don't have a single CHIM possible. But we are looking at setting up a CHIM for malaria.
The 55% protection what you see, is it because of strain variations? That's one thing. And the second point is, given that the segments can change, do you see emerging new rotaviruses?
Yes.
And both pose the challenge?
So in fact, when rotavirus vaccines were first designed, this was a big question. Should you go with a monovalent vaccine? Should you go with a multivalent vaccine and try to cover strains? What will happen when there is reassortment? And essentially what they found was that rotavirus vaccines are very different from other segmented virus vaccines. Influenza is a prime example where you need good strain coverage. With rotavirus, it appears that there is heterotypic protection, so a single strain can protect against multiple types. But it protects against strains that are not in the vaccine at the same 55%. I didn't show that data, but we have strain-specific protection.
Ma'am, what is your recommendation of, say, present context? The huge number of vaccines are available, and in the young ones, I could see in metropolis, n number of vaccines are recommended to the newly born child by the practitioners, whether it is government or non-government agencies. So what is your recommendation of how many out of the list one should go for? Because parents become very panicked that I have to have this also, and this also. So I would like to have your comment on.
I think it's always, people argue about what is okay to have a natural infection and what to protect from vaccination. Because the immune response that you make when you have a live bacterium, virus replicating within the human body is always more robust than one that is artificially induced. We know that. The problem is, do you know who will not die if they get the disease? So for measles, for example, in many people, measles is a perfectly mild disease, fever with rash, it goes away. You will make a good immune response. But some children will die of measles. I can't look at a child and say, this one, if they get measles, will survive, that one will die. So I think it's better to prevent disease than to take that chance. So my advice would be, every good vaccine that is out there, take it. I've given it to my kids. Some of them I worried because the vaccines came later, but I think it's fine to give vaccines because they are very rigorously tested. Vaccines are tested in healthy humans. They are not drugs. Drugs get tested in healthy people, but the efficacy of a drug is in sick people. So you're willing to allow a little safety, I take an antibiotic, I get a diarrhea. It's a side effect. I'm aware of that. I'll put up with it. For vaccines, the benchmark for safety is much higher.
I have okay, just one last quick question. So on the just-in-case approach to epidemics and so on, what is the status of epidemiological data in India? And how do we actually predict and take just-in-case type of actions?
You know, I've come to the thinking that every disease needs a champion, because if you don't have it, you don't have data. So we were really lucky with rotavirus. We are trying to do the same thing now with typhoid. But there are many diseases for which vaccines are important where we don't have sufficient information. Dengue is a prime example where a vaccine would be wonderful. Chikungunya, another one. Newspapers have more information than our surveillance systems. And of course, you know we don't have cholera in Bangladesh or in India, right? So.